In part 1, which we've dedicated to explaining the fundamental concepts, or rather concept, that one must be acquainted with before any understanding of the chapter can be achieved. In this one, we shall turn inward, towards the analysis of key verses. There are a few things that must first be noted. Properly understanding what a word means illuminates the whole verse, inasmuch as any given verse can illuminate a whole concinnity. As from any expression, irrespective of its size, may be derived certain connotations which will give us an idea of the direction of the verse or chapter, though in the chapter a deeper and prolonged analysis is necessary. Every concinnity in the Quran is a composite of excerpts. We find, for instance, that the story of the cave is an anthology of short stories. So are chapters 2, 3, 8, take your pick, are all anthologies, extracts from major narratives, essays into one subject or the other. Why this or that part of the story is chosen, and why they're placed in the order in which they are found, is a question that pertains to the logic of the verse, or, if a chapter, then to the overall logic of the Quran, and can only be answered once the moral of the story, as we say, or in the whole, the moral of each story is reached. But this moral is not like normal stories, where it's open to interpretation, because the author is obviously not omniscient that every minute element of his story, every implication, every presupposition, every potential contradiction is accounted for. Rather, the moral, in the Quranic sense given the omniscience of its author, is apodictic, or necessary. That is, where a novel, a film, a poem, or even a real-life situation or event may seem to resemble another, or may seem to belong to some general species of human inclination, if you will, but whose precise nature and mechanics eludes human reasoning, so much so that it's dismissed as arbitrary, the Quran knows what they are and exemplifies them. Or, let's say, the Quran specifically addresses them, so much so that every implication is known, accorded its precise place in the book and elaborated upon elsewhere. This way all the elements of the corpus are systematized, and no element escapes his grasp, which is the problem with human works. The Quran codifies these recurring historical motifs that punctuate human history, and presents us with their best examples, rather quintessential examples. For instance, there are numerous examples of scientific discovery, yet the Quran cites Abraham and his story over all of them, because the object of discovery here is what all discoveries made in any and all fields are approximating. As in his discovery, Abraham confronts the first principle that underlies all things as well as formulates a universally and eternally valid epistemological canon by which to attain it.
We also showed Abraham the wonders of the heavens and the earth, so he would be sure in faith. I have turned my face towards the one who has originated the heavens and the earth, being upright, and I am not one of the polytheists.
Or take the story of the man of knowledge who mentors Moses in chapter 18, who perpetrated acts which, though justified in their objective, don't seem to have any relation to one another on the surface. Killing the child to have his parents conceive a new one, compromising the ship to save its workers, and raising the wall that's verging to collapse to render the treasure hidden beneath it easier to find by the orphans. What correlation can these three stories possibly have? And why three stories in particular? To answer this is to answer the harder and more elusive question of how the man knew to target these things, or what sort of knowledge allowed him to prognosticate with such accuracy. This can only be answered by saying that the man had been acquainted with the same logical formula that underlies the chapter, that decided how many stories should be included in it, their types, lengths, order, i.e., the phenomena which the Quran calls, felicitously we presume, the cave. That's right. As noted in the previous chapter, the cave is not just a place, it's a phenomenon, as evidenced by the first of the four stories. It's given here that the young men sought refuge in the cave, but what makes it eerie is the phenomena that take place within it, particularly that of time dilation, which is what made us draw the analogy between the cave and black holes. We discerned a triadic structure in the story: abnegation, transition, and rejuvenation. A consistent theme that runs as a transition from a decaying or ruinous state towards a promising future, and the phenomenological conundra that manifests during the transition. The same triadic pattern is written all over the story of Moses and his mentor. Note the equivalence between the young men's abnegation, their desertion of their society and their ways, and the man's vandalism of the ship, his killing of the boy, which they meet not long thereafter. In justifying his acts to the dumbfounded Moses, we read that he feared that the boy, if allowed to live, would trouble his parents, expressing his wish that God would compensate them with a better one. We also read that he only sabotaged the ship so as to save its workers from extortion, and possibly death. There is here a clear sense of abnegation, but to see it, we must switch our perspective so as to, in some way, see the events happen from the perspective of the cave, to see the man as a living embodiment of the cave, and the sailors, the child's parents, the two orphans whose treasure awaits them, as, metaphorically, the young men who sought refuge in a cave. And to see each of these different stories as specifically expressing one of three distinct functions of the cave, as a deterrent, as a transformer, and as an expediter or facilitator. It deterred extortion, in the case of the sailors, transformed or reversed the parents' parental ordeal by killing the child, and expedited by raising the ramshackle wall so as to make the treasure accessible to the orphans. It is a facilitator or a facility, if you will, in that it preempted favorable scenarios, and a deterrent in that it prevented disfavorable scenarios, either way showing a transition from one state to another. The difference between the last two, the killing of the child and raising the wall, is that in the latter, the treasure was already there, underground, awaiting them. Clearly, the treasure situation warrants the role of facilitator or expediter more so than the other, given the facticity or contemporaneity of the treasure with the orphans as opposed to the possibility or mere conceivability of a new child to the parents. We see that what determines each function is the orientation of the subject. A facilitator or expediter more directly pertains to the good or favored outcome, whereas the transformer stresses the transformative or reconstructive, reversal side of things. The killing of the boy, time dilation in the case of the boys of the cave, the building of the barrier, etc.
Time dilation is a concept that describes how, when two observers are in relative motion or experiencing different gravitational fields, their perception of time can differ. The key concept is that time dilation results in one observer experiencing a longer period, while the other observer perceives a shorter period. The observer in motion experiences time at a slower rate compared to the observer at rest, where from the perspective of the stationary observer, time appears to pass more quickly for the moving observer.
It's obvious here that all the other scenarios are also transformative, but what's unique about transformation as such, as one of the cave's functions, is the emphasis on the details of transformation, the logistical, practical side of things. Whereas facilitation sees its object or prospect, and deterrence, the menace, the omen, the bugbear, lurking in the past, in transformation we stand in between, so to speak, between the menacing past and the favorable future. It's what creates the contrast between the two, and in perceiving the contrast, we're so situated as to be able to look both ways, i.e. assume either view. This completes the triad and gives a complete conceptual form to the cave, so that in looking back at the bugbear, we're deterring, or when looking at the future, we're expediting or facilitating, and in connecting the two, we're seeing the transition from one to the other, or the reverse, which we see in the second story, the man whose pride and avarice causes him to lose his garden. Incidentally, Toynbee identifies this phenomena, this reversal of one's gifts and endowments, as a major cause for the breakdown of civilizations, which calls to mind Pharaoh, Noah's people, Ad, etc. These are examples of the negative side of transformation. This transitive phenomenon is why we use the term apodictic in reference to Quranic narratives, as they're all modeled after the narrative structure named the cave. Perhaps this chapter serves, with respect to all other chapters, an architectonic role, or perhaps is their neural network, so to speak. Again, we borrowed the term apodictic from Kant's system, where apodictic judgment is that which connects two others and creates a sense of continuity between them, and is what allows the premise to have a conclusion, and vice versa.
We begin by judging something problematically, then perhaps accept it assertorically as true, and finally maintain it as inseparably united with the understanding, that is, as necessary and apodictic. Critique of pure reason.
Now, what's noteworthy, as far as this triad, is how they're arranged in the story of Dhul Qarnayn, the fourth and last story. We see here no actual transition, but a stalemate. The barrier which he built simply stands there, steadily separating two outcomes, showing neither a positive transition, like the mentor, nor a negative transition like the man of the garden. As we can see, each of the four examples, inasmuch as the situations which they contain, embody a unique aspect and function of the cave, and must therefore be approached and read with that in mind. Now, the stories of the garden, Moses and Dhul Qarnayn, only show us the effects of the phenomenon, human actions, cause and effect, and action and its repercussion, not the physics, as it were, of the whole thing, the more cosmic, if you will, side of things. These are found, and are made front and center, in the first story, the cave goers, where we get a closer look at how it appears from a first-person perspective. Here we find ourselves on the receiving end of the cave's power. What would things look like from such a viewpoint? We often hear stories of how a seeming coincidence changed a whole person's life. Take as an approximate example, Newton's apple, J.K. Rowling's delayed train from Manchester to London, the car accident that almost took the life of Hamza Yusuf, or, on the prophet's side, Joseph's well, Abraham's fire, Jonah's whale, Moses' escape from Egypt, and how each of these events utterly transformed the person's life. Such events are deemed significant and borderline miraculous because in some sense they shouldn't have happened, or they almost didn't happen. They're a once-in-a-lifetime event. And this fact gives them that same sense of time travel, or of going from one timeline to another, to an alternate reality. We see this in the sailor's case of narrowly escaping a dire situation, and of the orphans eventually digging up their treasure. Notice also that all too familiar sense of destroying so as to build, the recurring pattern, typically at the beginning, of creative destruction, sabotaging the ship, killing the child, or in the cave-goer's case, shunning their community, as Abraham did. The cave-goers didn't just leave their society behind, but used the cave to insulate themselves from it. And this has everything to do with the length of time they spent in the cave. The insulation was necessary, as the whole point of the transition performed by the cave is to cross into a completely different reality, or timeline, terminating that original one which this benign apparatus, the cave, treats as a failed project, hence the ship's situation, the killing of the child, both of which, outrageous though they are on the surface, things which hardly any vigilante would dare to try, obtain their validity from a cosmic and universal principle that's every bit as consistent with how we perceive nature to work. As we know, Islam's whole rationale rests entirely on eschatology. Everything, though particularly us human beings, has a destiny towards which we're headed. Life as we know it is a transition, in a way reminiscent of the cave's function, into a common destination, the hereafter, al-akhirah, about which we made a whole video. A word which translates to ultimate, in contrast to dunya, which means penultimate, or the stage preceding the last. Success or failure in this life is exclusively measured by this. In this setting, and for any given person, there are, like in Borges' Garden of Fork and Paths, multiple, or rather countless scenarios in which one's life can play out, but all but one is valid. Only one successfully gets you to your destination, paradise, while all others doom you to failure or hellfire. Dalal is the word used in the Quran, and which appears in translation as misguided. plausible a term though it is, as a general expression of what's going on, the sense in which it is used in the Quran is much deeper, where, for instance, we see it used in the context of death and dissolution, where a body is torn to shreds. We see here that dalal is a reference to a state in which something's as far as can be from what it should be, or as opposite to its true state as opposition can allow, evoking the sense of all or nothing, cancelling out all that's in between. In this same manner is your life evaluated. There's only one possibility, and that's deontically living how you're meant to live, i.e. Islam, which at its basis is a religion of abnegation, or renunciation, as the model of Abraham portrays. A faith that always starts off as an exception to some rule, to lift societies that have long been blanketed by layers of dogma. Such is the function of the cave, in that it starts off with reversal, with creative destruction. This is the painful peeling back of the layers of dogma, of desertion, of running a ship aground, of killing a child. These acts are related, those discussed under the problem of evil, like why, if God's so loving and just, should there be suffering and death in the world? Moses had the same question. In no way is killing the child justifiable, or so he thought at the moment. In no way is compromising the ship so full of workers justifiable. In no way should you, the man lending a hand to these orphans by heaving a swallow, not be paid for doing so. These questions are all equivalent. It's no wonder why, from all the lessons that can be learned from this particular segment, the notion of patience as regards the problem of evil should be recognized first. But what's yet ambiguous is the connection that this little encounter has with the Exodus story, where we see Moses applying the same principle that he'd learned from the man. A parallel can be drawn between the ship, which the man sabotaged in order to save its workers from the extortionist king, and the extraction of the people of Israel from Egypt and its tyrant. Their displacement and the killing of the child, the lifting of the wall, and the bringing down of the commandments. You may ask what killing the child has to do with the people of Israel having been displaced. And the answer is that, as all acts we read, killing the child is symbolic. It expresses the fact that by deserting that reality, it's as though you kill the version of yourself that would still be there, as Borges aptly puts it in his short story.
In all fictional works, each time a man is confronted with several alternatives, he chooses one and eliminates the others.
The key word here is eliminate, as by choosing to desert, to opt out, they in practice eliminated all other possibilities that aren't this. The weight of this act makes it equivalent to killing, and, as we know, God tells the people of Israel,
It will be as if they killed all of mankind, and whoever saves a life, it will be as if they saved all of mankind.
that the parents whom the man says are to be compensated with a new, better, and more righteous child are a personification of the idea of destiny, for that's what parents ultimately symbolize. As Joseph's childhood vision tells us, the mischief which the child would have brought upon his parents is equivalent to not living one's purpose and following one's destiny. If the sole reason that we're alive at all is to fulfill that purpose for which we were created, and if the parents symbolize said purpose, then not living one's purpose is not different from being a problem child. Thus, killing the child proves necessary with respect to this objective, perhaps explains the meaning behind a recurring expression which seems to express a sense of trading lives, that the act of killing, in this case an innocent soul, is only justified if done under such circumstances as the man of knowledge demonstrates in the chapter. And this undertaking, this act of killing so as to raise anew, or as we called it, creative destruction, shows another aspect, if not a core aspect of the cave, that the cave ultimately is a mechanism that performs acts of this nature. Thus it's very interesting and quite serendipitous to see how these wild stunts we see performed by the man and which then stupefied Moses are reenacted by Moses in his mission of taking his people out of Egypt. One area in which this activity occurs is the very practice or craft that feeds us: agriculture. Here, we find the same triadic principle. Before any farming takes place, one must first find fertile land. Now, the planting of seeds comes after the soil is first tilled, and tilling the soil is decisive, as we're here transforming the land from whatever state it was in into a state of fertility, putting it into commission, as it were. Now, the land could have been used as something else, or for other purposes, but its true value, its true use, appears in its fertility, its ability to become fruitful, to give out, i.e. in farming in particular. It's in this sense that anything can be said to be truly living its purpose. It's actively expressing its nature, that which it contains. The tilling enlivens the soil. This act cancels out the previous state of the soil, of being a refuse, rendering a new state. The object of this is to transform the land, and to bring out its true value. The cave carries out exactly the same function, but with respect to individuals. This is where the symbol of the cow, a symbol of culture, represents the transformative impulse. Before the introduction of the cave, the cave's function begins with this impulse supplied by the cow, and performs the transformative activity/process initiated thereby.